This is Kári Stefánsson, who is the CEO and chairman and founder of deCODE Genetics, which is a company in Iceland that is trying to mine the genetic information of the Icelandic people in an effort to find out what makes us sick in every possible way, but particularly in the most important areas of disease like cancer, mental illness, heart disease, diabetes. And he's been doing this for a long time. And recently, the company has had a great deal of success finding genes that indicate a relationship between things like heart disease and a genetic location for something that indicates sickness for heart disease, for diabetes, for schizophrenia. And I think one of the first questions I want to ask is, what does that do for us?
What does it do for us? I would actually, I have been working for the past few years, as you said, looking for variants in the sequence of the human genome that confer risk of common diseases. And I'm, however, much more really interested in human health, but the only way to get at it is to understand weaknesses. When it comes to common diseases, which is what it is that we are studying, they are very different from the classic genetic diseases, where if you have a mutation, you develop a disease, and if you don't have the mutation, you won't. In the case of the common diseases, which are probably best defined as diseases where there is both a genetic and environmental component to risk, the common disease, and the reason that is important, it means that there is something in our environment that affects the same biochemical pathways as the genetic variation. So if you find the genetic variation, you have a key to what it is that you can use to prevent environmental influences, for example, to be turned into a disease, or where you can basically help people to avoid certain environment or seek certain environment to prevent the genetic predisposition from being turned into a disease. Let's take, for example, we published on a variant in a gene that is called TCF7L2, that if you inherit a variant in that gene from both of your parents, you have your risk of type 2 diabetes is doubled. All right, what does that do for you? To know that, what does it do for us as a community or society to know that? It turns out that this variant, if you have it, that doubles your risk, is such that you respond much better to change in lifestyle. You respond much better to exercise, to calorie restriction, and you even respond better to certain medications that prevent pre-diabetes from turned into diabetes. So for me personally, first of all, we are making discoveries for this, we are seeking new knowledge for the sake of knowledge, which is always wonderful. Secondly, I am absolutely convinced that it's going to help us to prevent common diseases.
Watson and Crick made their discovery about 55 years ago. And since then, pretty much every year, every month, and lately probably every day, someone in your profession or mine or both has said that the genetic basis of what we are and who we are will, once we understand it, all the diseases that we die of will be solved, and we'll figure them out, and we'll be able to have a magic bullet for various cancers and for preventing diabetes and heart disease.
I refuse to be held responsible for the stupidity of others. Mine is enough.
But what is it you're doing for a living then?
Yeah, I would not, first of all, the common diseases of man, you have to look at them as sort of the limitations in our design, so they will stay with us forever.
Okay, let's look at schizophrenia, because that's something that you're familiar with and that you've worked on. What has deCODE's knowledge about schizophrenia genetics contributed to the improvement of that condition?
Nothing. Absolutely zero. But it has, however, if you think about what has it done to help us to understand schizophrenia, and unfortunately things in this field do not happen overnight. If you make a discovery today that gives you insight into a fundamental mechanism of disease and everything works perfectly, it takes between 10 to 15 years to turn such a discovery into a drug in the market. So even if our discovery that we made a few years back would lead to a drug on the market, we would not have seen any sign of it yet. But let me point out to you what happened. What is interesting about the common diseases is that they seem that the sequence variants, the variants in our sequence that seem to contribute to them, all of them, or many of them, seem to be under selection. Let me give you an example. We found a variant in a gene that makes what is called glutathione A4 hydrolase that is found in...
Some of these guys may not know what that is.
That's not... Yeah, I have a vague idea myself. It's an enzyme that participates in an inflammatory pathway that is called the glutathione pathway. I remember the inflammatory pathways are the pathways that protect us against infections. And we found this variant in the glutathione A4 hydrolase gene that has a very subtle influence on the risk of heart attack in Caucasians. But it more than doubles the risk of heart attack in African Americans. It is found in 38% of Caucasians. It is only found in 6% of African Americans, and it is not found in Africa at all. So what does that mean, basically? It's fascinating, because when man left Africa about 60,000 years ago, he was exposed to different infectious microorganisms. And in response to that, probably increased production of this inflammatory mediator that can cause heart attack. But that was irrelevant then, because life expectancy was so short that no one developed heart attack. But then gradually, as life expectancy increased, the people outside of Africa compensate for that by changing other parts of the genome. People in Africa have no reason to do that. So eventually, 300 years ago or whatever it was, when the Africans were forcefully moved from Africa to America and elsewhere in the world, and this variant was introduced into their genome, it became lethal.
So since the theoretical purpose of this conference is to look 5-10 years down the road at things that will be concrete, let's do that. Let's do that with this. In 10 years, will every African American who has a physical take this test, and as a result, they will be advised to exercise twice as much?
Yeah. All right. This is not all as futile as you're indicating. You see,
I'm neutral.
Let me finish.
No.
You see, this is all a question of what we want to do. The knowledge will be there. 5 years from now, we will probably have found almost all the sequence variants that have impact on the risk of common diseases. These variants will have relatively subtle impact on the risk. They will at the most double or triple the risk above and beyond what the average person in society has. And the question is, what do you want to use that for? Do you want to put together a battery of predictive tests so you can figure out what your risks are in particular, so you can do something about it? And actually, when it comes to prevention of heart attack, we can do an awful lot more than exercising. We can contain some of the risk by the use of statins. We can deal with some of the risk by placement of stents, etc., in narrowed coronary arteries. So there are a lot of things that you can do. The big question, however, in the end, is what kind of an impact is this going to have on public health, not only in the western part of the world, but in the world in general. And, are we going to increase the length of human life expectancy by doing this? Or are we simply going to make the life of people more productive during their lifetime? And that's the big question. The question is, how are we going to use this?
Are you sure that we'll do one or the other? Both of them?
I don't think that, I actually don't think this is going to have a meaningful impact on the life expectancy of a relatively fortunate person. I don't think that there are many in this room who would be living beyond the age of 100 in spite of understanding the risk they have in a meaningful manner, because I think there is a certain cap on our potential life expectancy, and even these genetic discoveries are not going to have much impact on that.
Well, let's just focus on the first 100 years. You just announced a test for diabetes that is a predictor. Mm-hmm. Is that something we should all go out and take?
I cannot answer that question.
Okay, what about this one? Why would anyone ever take it?
That's interesting. But the way in which I see this is that there is a discovery that was made. In this case, it was made by us. We found a sequence variant that if you inherit it from both of your parents, you have double the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And there is an epidemic of type 2 diabetes, at least in this part of the world. And the question is whether we, society, or whether we have the obligation, once we have made this discovery, of making a test like this available to people so they can have it decided or determined whether they are at this particular risk. It could be argued that we have the obligation to do that. Not to impose it on everyone, but to give people the choice of having this test or not. If you are at this risk, you have a particular reason, number one, to attend to your lifestyle, to exercise, through diet, and even by taking medications that have been shown to decrease the probability that pre-diabetes is turned into a diabetes. Well, we have lived as a species without this test for quite some time, and we would continue to do that.
Now, we have this epidemic of diabetes going on, and it seems like it's related to our inability to move a lot and our desire to eat an awful lot. If we upped the movement and lessened the calorie intake, wouldn't that have a better effect than even your test?
Yeah. The problem is that, number one, that there is more than just body mass that predisposes to diabetes. This variant happened to influence insulin secretion, not insulin resistance. So basically, it affects the opposite end of the spectrum compared to the obesity. Everyone, if all of us would live a perfect life, we would restrict our calorie intake, we would exercise vigorously, and only think pure, beautiful thoughts. None of us would develop type 2 diabetes. That's true. But the question is only how do you motivate people to do this? If you take those who are just obese and have no type 2 diabetes, it turns out to be rather difficult to motivate them to lose weight. If you take those who have already developed type 2 diabetes, it's easier to motivate them to exercise and to attend to the lifestyle. Our expectation is that a test like this is going to put you somewhere in the middle.
Do you think it will help with the beautiful thoughts thing if you find out that you are predisposed to secrete insulin?
Help to
promote beautiful thoughts if you find out that you're predisposed to a disease for which there are no particular medicines that are useful at the moment.
I am rather unfamiliar with the beautiful thoughts, all right.
Okay, speaking of which, you told me yesterday something I hadn't read or known about your work, which is that you have discovered or are hunting around for genes that will predict who we want to mate with.
Yeah, no.
Where does that fit into the whole public health spectrum?
You see, when you begin to poke around and look systematically, like we are doing, we are working with the same population on many questions. And if you're working with bright people, and I totally disagree with a guy who was speaking here before who insists that just hard work is what matters, not the geniuses. I'm working with some spectacularly bright.
You can talk to him at the break. Talk to them.
Let me finish what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm working with some spectacularly bright people whom I cannot prevent from asking questions that are relatively impractical for us. And one of our guys was looking at our genealogy. We have the genealogy of the entire nation going 1,100 years back in time. And he was looking, and we have genotype. We have looked at sequence variations, 300,000 sequence variation in the genome of tens of thousands of people. And he started to look at it. And it turns out that there is a sequence variant in a gene that I'm not going to mention here today, that where women with a certain sequence variant have a tendency to mate with men with another sequence variant, and the p-value actually of the probability that would happen by chance alone is absolutely vanishingly small. So when you have a lot of data, you have the instruments to mine the data, and you have people whom you cannot prevent from asking exciting questions. You come up with answers now and then. So we have this genetic variant that seems to influence the way in which people mate. So the question, this idea of free will is probably an illusion.
Fabulous. What did James Crick say, when you're nothing but a pack of neutrons? Is that what this suggests?
No, it does not necessarily suggest, but it is terribly interesting. Let me tell you, if you take our schizophrenia stuff, and I used to be a neurologist and neuropathologist, and I have been obsessed with questions about the function of the brain. And the ultimate function of the brain is to serve as an organ of consciousness, all right? And you can divide consciousness into two components. It is the alertness, which people usually lose instantaneously when I begin to lecture about genetics. And the other is content of consciousness. And content of consciousness are thoughts and emotions. And you ask the question, what is it that generates thoughts? And what is it that generates emotions? And actually, we know an awful lot more today about the function of specific parts of the brain than we did 25 years ago, but we know nothing about the way in which the brain generates thoughts and emotions. And actually, if I would ask this great audience to define thought for me and give them the rest of the week to do so, you wouldn't come up with any answer, because philosophers have tried to do this for a long time and not succeeded. So if you think about schizophrenia, which is a disease of thought and emotions, and you are asking the question of how can we study a disorder of a function that we cannot even define? You're going to put together a hypothesis that you're subsequently going to test, and how are you going to put together a hypothesis about an abnormality of a function you cannot even define? And this is where genetics comes in extraordinarily strong, because when it comes to genetics, the only thing you need to do is to determine that a disease is familial, and then you can go out and you can isolate a gene. And that's what we did. We went out and we isolated a gene that makes a protein called neuroregulin-1. And what does neuroregulin-1 do? Neuroregulin-1 stimulates the formation of synapses. And the synapses where neurons talk to each other. All right? But then we have found a gene, it confers a risk, and it confers the risk through modulation of a function of a protein that forms the places where neurons talk together, and that's exactly what you would expect there would be an abnormality in schizophrenia. But then you have also an environmental component to the risk. There is only a 70% of the risk of schizophrenia is genetic. 30% is environmental. So the question is, how does the environment affect the brain as an organ of content of consciousness? How does the environment influence our brain as an instrument of thought and emotions? And short of a baseball bat to your head, it does so through the experience of the beholder. All right? And so the question is, what does experience do to the biology of the brain? One of the things it does is that it stimulates synaptic plasticity. All right? And actually, neuroregulin-1 does not only stimulate formation of synapses, it also stimulates synaptic plasticity. So here we have in one and the same thing the merits of nature and nurture. We have the genetic risk through sequence variation in the gene, and we have the difference in the way in which the brain responds to experience through the protein made by that particular gene. So this is in a way, this is an example of what kind of an insight, first of all, what kind of a power the genetic approach gives you, because it is hypothesis independent. You don't have to put together hypothesis, you just plow into the problem in a relatively non-intellectual, brute force way. You pull out the gene, and then you can begin to work put together your hypothesis. But what is more important, it helps you in many ways, not only to deal with the genetic component, it gives you also an insight, the key to understanding of the environmental contribution to the risk of the condition that you're studying.
I wanted to ask you, based on the research you're doing that relies on fast computers to analyze millions of pieces of information, the issue of patents has become a very difficult one to understand. drugs are patented, processes are patented. Should various locales in the human genome that, for instance, say deCODE Genetics or some other organization discovers, should they be patented or patentable?
Patents should only be used. It should only be allowed to use patents where it stimulates innovation. And patents are terribly important instruments in our society to allow for productivity, to allow for the development of new things, because you cannot raise funds to develop products unless you have some way of protecting your innovation.
But is something found in the basic genetic information of a human being innovative information that you should be allowed to patent?
You should not be allowed to patent discoveries. You should only be allowed to patent innovation. So I don't think that you should be allowed to patent genes. I think that would be a mistake to allow that. Our society, when it comes to this, has been going through transformation over the past 10 years. The PTA was considering to allow patenting of little bits and pieces of genes to begin with. That was abandoned. And now pretty much you have to attach considerable utility to sequence variants that you're patenting. You can, for example, patent the use of certain sequence variants for the purpose of diagnostics, but you cannot simply sequence genes or sequence variants without having utility attached to them. And I am in favor of that.
You are increasingly in a race with a bunch of academic institutions to discover genes and their relationships to diseases. It wasn't the case a few years ago. It was kind of you. It seems that they're getting better at it than they used to be. Is that good for you, bad for you? Do you not care? They certainly seem to care about you.
There's a spectacular talent of geneticists in academia, people who have been making a lot of contributions over the years. We have made a reasonable amount of contributions ourselves, but we have not been the only players in the field. We have a lot of competition for what we are doing now, and that is good for us. It has been good for us. You know, people are burning the midnight oil almost every day in our company now. You people don't take vacations. I hate vacations, so I'm pleased to see that this competition is...
Is there a genetic variant for that?
No. No, I actually, there's no genetic variant for that. It's just so great fun to work on genetics that there is no reason to take any vacation.
I totally feel the same way about my
Now, it is an exciting, there are exciting times now. The new technology is allowing much more systematic approach to the study of genetics of disease, and that is leading to enormous productivity in the field. There's an absolutely great fun, and it's not only in the study of disease, it's also in just understanding human variation. We isolated a few weeks back 4 genes that decide whether you become blonde or your hair becomes brown or red, your eyes blue, brown or green, your skin dark or light. It's great fun to begin to understand that, and also understand how these genes have been under selection since man left Africa, 60,000 years ago.
What would make more money for your company? A package of tests predictive of diabetes, or one predictive of who I might wish to mate with?
I think that a test to match together people would never become particularly interesting, or never make particularly large amount of money, because I think we are all of us going to walk around with the illusion that we are selecting our partners on the basis of their attributes that have nothing to do with sequence variations of this sort. I'm not going to go into the details of what it is that I think that people are going to be chasing, but I think that a test for risk of type 2 diabetes could be extraordinarily useful in society. Whether or not it is going to make a lot of money for us is a different issue, but I think it is very important to have the choice, to have the opportunity of figuring out whether you're at a particular risk of a disease where there is something you can do about it.
I agree. We have 1 second left, so I'll take it to thank you very much. And, We look forward to the tests in the New Yorker cartoon that involves lots of sequences and mates.
Thank you.
Thank you.